This is not a story from yesterday. This happened over 1,000 years ago. And the people who did this, the Polynesians, they didn't just do it once. They did it hundreds of times. They found every single island scattered across the Pacific Ocean, the largest ocean on Earth, covering 1/3 of the entire planet's surface. No other civilization in human history ever came close to doing what they did. So naturally, scientists, historians, and archaeologists spent 200 years trying to figure out where did these people actually come from. And for 200 years, the answer seemed settled. Taiwan. The theory was called out of Taiwan. It said that Polynesian ancestors originally came from the island of Taiwan, moved through the Philippines, spread into the Pacific, and eventually became the people who colonized Hawaii, Samoa, Tonga, New Zealand, and Easter Island. This theory was in textbooks. It was taught in universities. Governments built entire national identity narratives on it. Settled science. Case closed. Until October 2016. When a team of scientists at Harvard University extracted DNA from 3 ancient skeletons buried in a graveyard in Vanuatu, a small island in the Pacific, and the results came back completely wrong, not slightly off, not a small error, completely wrong. The DNA did not match the story at all, and suddenly, 200 years of settled history started to crack. If you find lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe right now, because this channel is built for exactly this. But before we go any further, quick question. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Let's drop your country in the comments. I read every single one. And here is a more personal question. Have you ever seriously thought about what your own DNA might say about where you really come from? Hold that thought. By the end of this video, your answer might completely change. Now, back to that graveyard in Vanuatu, because the people buried there, they should not exist. Not according to the history books anyway. The year is 2004. Archaeologists are digging on the island of Efat in Vanuatu at a site called Teuma, and they start pulling out bones, 3,000-year-old bones. But it is not just the age that stops them cold. It is the way these people were buried. Their skulls had been removed, deliberately, after death, and replaced with coral and shells. This burial practice was not from Southeast Asia. It was not from Taiwan. It matched rituals found in Papua New Guinea, a completely different population, thousands of miles away. These were the Lapita people, the ancient civilization that archaeologists had long believed was the founding ancestor of all Polynesians. So, in 2016, Dr. Pontus Skoglund and his team at Harvard University decided to extract and sequence the DNA from these Teuma skeletons. 31 scientists from multiple countries were involved. The results were checked by 2 independent laboratories, and what they found, published in the journal Nature, created an immediate scientific controversy. The Lapita people's DNA pointed almost entirely to East Asia. Specifically, a lineage connected to the Kankanai people of the northern Philippines and Taiwanese Aboriginal populations. So far, that matched the out of Taiwan theory. Yeah, but here is where it breaks down completely. Modern Polynesians, the people living in Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, New Zealand today, they carry significant DNA from Papuan populations, the people of Papua New Guinea. The Lapita skeletons had almost zero Papuan DNA. Zero. Professor Ron Pinhasi of University College Dublin put it plainly, the unexpected results about Oceanian history highlight the power of ancient DNA to overthrow established models of the human past. And Dr. Matthew Spriggs of the Australian National University added, their original base population is Asian, but what happened next, that is the mystery. So think about this carefully. The founding population of the Pacific, the Lapita, carried East Asian DNA with almost no Papuan ancestry. But their descendants, modern Polynesians, carry significant Papuan DNA, which means somewhere between 3,000 years ago and today, the original bloodline was replaced by someone. And that replacement, it happened fast. Within just a few generations of the Lapita arriving in the Pacific, their genetic signature began to disappear. But replaced by who? And why does nobody remember it happening? Here is something that should be impossible. An entire founding population, genetically replaced within 200 to 300 years. And not one oral tradition, not one story, not one memory passed down through generations that says, once other people came and everything changed. The genetic record is very clear about what happened. Dr. Catherine Nagela, she lead researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany, one of the top ancient DNA labs in the world. Her team analyzed multiple ancient Pacific skeletons using a technique that extracts DNA from the densest part of the skull bone. She described the results as a real game changer. What the DNA showed was this. After the Lapita settled remote Oceania, the islands far out into the Pacific, a massive wave of Papuan ancestry began flooding into their gene pool from the Bismarck Archipelago, from populations connected to New Guinea. This was not a one-time event. It happened gradually, over multiple generations, through repeated contact between near-Oceanian and remote Oceanian people. But here is the scale of what happened. Well, in some modern Polynesian populations today, Papuan ancestry makes up nearly 25% of the entire genome. 1/4 of who they are, genetically, came from a population that their history books, their oral traditions, and their founding stories almost never mention. Think about that for a moment. 1/4 of your DNA could come from people your ancestors completely forgot about. Or, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, people who perhaps were not meant to be remembered. Now, scientists are careful here. The data shows the replacement happened gradually. That suggests repeated intermarriage, not necessarily conflict. But here is the thing that haunts researchers. The distribution of that Papuan ancestry across all Polynesian populations, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island, is almost mathematically consistent. Everywhere, equally, the same percentage. Dr. Pontus Skoglund and the Reich Lab at Harvard describe this as a single shared founding event, something that happened once at a specific point and then spread with the people as they continued moving across the Pacific. One event. That touched everyone, and yet nobody talks about it. No oral tradition, no memory. But there is one place, one tiny isolated group of islands, where this Papuan flood never arrived. And the people living there today carry a genome so ancient, so untouched, that scientists believe they are the closest thing alive to the original Polynesian founding population. Until a few years ago, nobody knew they existed. There is an island in the Solomon Islands called Tikopia. Most people have never heard of it. It is tiny, about 5 square kilometers, each home to around 1,200 people. And it sits at the edge of the Polynesian world, geographically isolated, culturally preserved, and, as scientists discovered in 2019, genetically extraordinary. When researchers compared the DNA of Tikopia people against ancient Lapita skeletal samples from 3,000 years ago, the match was startling. Dr. Elizabeth Matisu-Smith, molecular anthropologist at the University of Otago in New Zealand, who has spent decades studying Pacific DNA, described it as hearing an echo across 3,000 years. The ancient dead and the living islanders were whispering the same genetic sequence back to each other. Tikopia, along with a handful of other small islands called the Polynesian outliers. These people show dramatically lower Papuan admixture than any Polynesian heartland population. They're in some cases close to zero. They missed the flood. And because they did, their DNA is essentially a biological time capsule, a preserved record of what the original Pacific colonizers actually carried in their genes before the replacement event changed everything. Now, how did this happen? Because for centuries, Tikopia chose isolation. The island is so small that the community developed strict social protocols to manage population growth. They did not expand. They did not invite outsiders in. Tikopia's leaders made a conscious community decision to stay closed, and that decision, made for survival, accidentally archived the genetic memory of an entire lost civilization. But here is where this becomes more than just a fascinating scientific discovery. And if the outliers carry the oldest surviving Polynesian genome, and the Polynesian heartland populations carry a genome that was substantially rewritten, then the question of who the real original Polynesians are becomes suddenly very complicated, not just scientifically, politically, because buried beneath the Lapita signal, beneath the Papuan flood, there is a third genetic layer inside the Polynesian genome, one that has absolutely no business being in the Pacific, one that points directly to South America. 1947. A Norwegian explorer named Thor Heyerdahl builds a wooden raft out of balsa wood and rope. He names it Kon-Tiki, and he sails it from Peru, across the Pacific Ocean, to Polynesia. His theory, Polynesians originally came from South America. The scientific establishment mocked him. Textbooks dismissed him. But for 73 years, the consensus was that Heyerdahl was simply wrong. Then, in July 2020, a paper published in Nature journal changed everything. Dr. Alexander Ioannidis, postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University in the United States, and Dr. Andres Moreno Estrada, professor at the National Laboratory of Genomics for Biodiversity in Mexico, they led a study analyzing DNA from 807 living people across 17 Polynesian island groups and 15 Native American populations. What they found was not a rumor, not a theory, not a possibility. It was a clear, consistent, statistically confirmed signal of Native American DNA embedded in the genomes of Eastern Polynesians. In Dr. Ioannidis' own words, we found identical by descent segments of Native American ancestry across several Polynesian islands. It was conclusive evidence that there was a single shared contact event. The contact happened around 1200 CE, before Columbus, before any European ship entered the Pacific, before the Western world even knew the Pacific existed, which means, at some point around the year 1200, Polynesians and South Americans met each other in the middle of the ocean, and the proof of that meeting was written permanently into their DNA. Now here is the question that nobody can fully answer yet. Did Polynesians sail east and reach South America, or did South Americans somehow sail west into the open Pacific against prevailing winds and currents? The DNA cannot tell us direction, only contact. But here is a clue. The sweet potato, domesticated in South America, was already present across Polynesia centuries before European contact. The word for it in Rapa Nui is almost identical to the word in Colombian indigenous languages. Someone carried that crop across the ocean. DNA now confirms they also carried their bloodline with it. Heyerdahl was wrong about the direction of origin, but he was right that contact happened. And the island that carries the most powerful evidence of that contact, it is also the island with the most misunderstood history in the entire Pacific, Easter Island, Rapa Nui. And what DNA found in its ancient bones does not just confirm South American contact, it completely dismantles the collapse story that the whole world was taught. 900 stone statues, backs to the ocean, faces turned inward. For over a century, archaeologists, journalists, and popular science books told us the same story about Easter Island. Yet the people who built these statues, the Rapa Nui civilization, they destroyed themselves. They cut down all their trees. The forests disappeared. Crops failed. The population collapsed. They turned on each other. It became the world's favorite cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when a civilization consumes its own resources. Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, made this story globally famous. There was just one problem. The DNA does not support it. In 2017, a study led by Dr. Pontus Skoglund and colleagues, published in Current Biology, analyzed ancient DNA from Rapa Nui human remains dating to before European contact in 1722. The genetic picture they found was not a population in crisis. It was a population that was healthy, diverse, stable, no bottleneck in the genome, no sign of the catastrophic population crash that the collapse theory absolutely requires. Dr. Carl Lipo, professor at Binghamton University in New York, who has spent years excavating Rapa Nui alongside Dr. Terry Hunt, put it this way: the Moai were not a sign of a civilization falling apart. They were a sign of a civilization that was thriving. The statues were built to honor ancestors and distribute resources efficiently. The people were not destroying their island. They were managing it. So, if the civilization did not collapse from within, what actually destroyed Rapa Nui? The answer is colonial history, and it is ugly. In 1862, Peruvian slave ships arrived at Rapa Nui. They kidnapped between 1,400 and 2,000 people. That was nearly half of the entire remaining population. Among those taken, virtually every person who could read Rongorongo. Rongorongo, the only writing system ever independently developed in Oceania, a script carved into wooden tablets, and today completely undeciphered, because the people who knew how to read it were taken, enslaved. Most of them died in Peru. Their DNA, through their descendants scattered across South America, survives. Their knowledge does not. The genome preserved the bloodline, nothing preserved the language. And this pattern of DNA telling a completely different story from the history that was taught, it does not stop at Easter Island. 4,000 miles to the northwest, in Hawaii, there is a genetic discovery so controversial that it has already walked into a courtroom. And the question it raises, nobody in power wants to answer it. Well, here's a question that sounds simple, but is not. How do you prove you are indigenous? In Hawaii, the legal answer is documented genealogical descent from people living on the Hawaiian Islands before January 1st, 1778, the year Captain Cook arrived. That definition controls eligibility for land trusts, federal benefits, political representation, billions of dollars. And now, commercial DNA testing, available to anyone online for under $100, is beginning to challenge that system in ways that indigenous Hawaiian communities find deeply threatening. Because here is what modern genomic science shows about native Hawaiian DNA. The genome of a modern native Hawaiian carries multiple layers: the original Polynesian founding population, the Lapita ancestry, the Papuan admixture, the South American contact signal, and significant European and East Asian ancestry introduced after 1778. The Reich Lab at Harvard, led by Dr. David Reich, one of the most respected ancient DNA researchers in the world, has mapped this multi-layered ancestry in detail. And the question genomic science now poses is brutally simple. If the founding Polynesian genome was already a mosaic of multiple ancient populations, and if modern native Hawaiians carry additional layers introduced after contact, at what point does native Hawaiian DNA become a meaningful biological category? And at what point does it become just a political label? Dr. Kim Tallbear, professor at the University of Alberta in Canada, and one of the leading scholars studying indigenous genetics and identity, has a very clear answer to this. She argues that using genetic testing to define or challenge indigenous identity is a form of colonial thinking wrapped in scientific language. In her words, it reduces a living culture, a living people, and a living relationship with the land to a percentage on a chart. And she is right that culture cannot be sequenced. Traditional Hawaiian culture is built around the concept of kuleana, a deep responsibility rooted in ancestral connection to land. That responsibility is passed through generations of practice, language, and memory, not through haplogroups. But in 2022, a legal case involving Hawaii's land trust system used genetic testing as part of a challenge to an indigenous eligibility claim. The case was quietly settled, the precedent never formally established, but the warning shot clearly fired. If DNA can challenge identity in Hawaii, what happens in New Zealand? Because the Maori genome contains a bottleneck so extreme and so mathematically precise that it points to something almost impossible, an entire nation, built from a single fleet. And DNA has now found exactly where that fleet set sail from: New Zealand, the last major landmass on Earth to be permanently settled by humans. While Europe was building Gothic cathedrals and China was printing books, New Zealand had never seen a human footprint. A 2022 study published in PNAS by Dr. Simon Bickler and colleagues, using the largest radiocarbon dating dataset ever assembled from New Zealand archaeological sites, established the arrival of the first Polynesian settlers at approximately 1250 CE. Think about that. 1250 CE, less than 800 years ago. And the people who arrived, who were they? How many were there? The genome has a specific answer. Analysis of Maori mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed through the female line, shows that the founding female population of New Zealand was somewhere between 50 and 100 women. 50 to 100 women. The entire Maori nation, Today, nearly 900,000 people descended from a group that could fit inside a small school gymnasium. The genetic bottleneck visible in the Maori genome is so sharp and so narrow that researchers describe it as a funnel. Trace it backward through time, and at the very bottom, you have a single fleet, possibly launched over the course of just a few years. Dr. Alexander Ioannidis of Stanford University and Dr. Andrés Moreno Estrada of Mexico's National Genomics Laboratory traced that fleet's origin. Their 2021 study showed that canoes first departed from the shores of Samoa around 800 CE. They reached Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, then spread in all directions, reaching Easter Island by 1210 CE and New Zealand's shores by 1250 CE. Hawaii, the mythological Maori homeland that chiefs have recited in genealogical chants for centuries, may have a real genetic address, and it is somewhere in the Cook Islands. Here is what makes this extraordinary. Maori oral tradition, called wakapapa, is the recitation of genealogical lineages stretching back to the first canoes. Chiefs memorize and recite these lineages as the most sacred form of cultural knowledge. For generations, Western academics dismissed these recitations as mythology. Genomic science is now beginning to confirm them, at the population level, not myth. Migration data. But here's the thing. The DNA traces the fleet. It confirms the arrival. It maps the origin. What it cannot fully explain is what the arriving fleet found when they got there, because growing archaeological evidence from New Zealand's South Island suggests the earliest Maori settlements may have encountered a landscape that was not completely uninhabited. And if that is true, it means there is yet another layer to this story, one that goes deeper than the Lapita, deeper than the Papuan flood, deeper than the South American contact. A layer that does not even fully belong to our species. Strip everything away. The Lapita, the Papuan replacement, the South American contact, the Maori founding fleet. Go deeper. 40,000 years. Because buried at the very bottom of the Polynesian genome, deeper than any migration event we have discussed, there is a DNA layer that did not come entirely from modern humans. Not entirely. The Denisovans. They were a separate species of human. We know almost nothing about what they looked like, how they lived, or where exactly they existed. Almost everything we know about them comes from a single finger bone and 2 teeth found in a cave in Siberia. That is it, 1 finger bone. And yet, their genome survived, not in Siberia, not in Europe, in the Pacific. Research confirmed that Melanesian people, the populations of Papua New Guinea and the surrounding islands, carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA, the highest concentration of archaic human ancestry found anywhere on Earth. Dr. Joshua Akey of the University of Washington, who co-led a landmark 2016 study published in Science Journal, stated, "All of our genomes are a mosaic of different ancestries. Some of the sequences modern humans inherited from Denisovans helped our ancestors survive and reproduce." Now connect this back to everything we have covered. When the ancestors of Papuans moved through Southeast Asia, they interbred with Denisovans. They carried that ancient DNA with them. Then, when that Papuan ancestry flooded into the Lapita gene pool and rewrote the Polynesian genome, the Denisovan DNA traveled with it across the entire Pacific Ocean, which means today, in the genome of a person living in Samoa or Tonga or Hawaii or New Zealand, there is a strand of DNA that was last copied inside the body of a being that was not quite human. And that DNA has been traveling across the Pacific for 40,000 years. But here is the part that keeps researchers awake at night. Dr. Ryan Bolender of the University of Texas presented evidence at the 2016 American Society of Human Genetics conference suggesting that the picture in Melanesia is even more complicated, that there may have been a third archaic human population, unknown, unnamed, with no fossil record whatsoever, that also contributed DNA to Pacific Islander ancestors. In his own words, human history is a lot more complicated than we thought it was. A species we have never found, whose bones we have never held, whose face we cannot imagine, but whose DNA, right now, is walking around the Pacific Islands. And one more thing before we close. All of this, the Lapita, the replacement, the South American contact, the Denisovan inheritance, all of this is based on the populations that science has managed to sequence so far. There is one island chain whose ancient DNA remains almost completely unsampled. One founding story that genomic science has not yet been able to fully tell. And when those sequences are finally read, the map we spent this entire documentary building may need to be rebuilt, again, from the beginning. The Pacific does not give up its dead easily, but its DNA, it gives up one molecule at a time, and every single molecule rewrites the map.